Okay, welcome everyone officially to today's installment for our Google Analytics Power Webinar series. This is number 6 in our series. If you've joined us before, thank you for returning. If this is your first webinar, welcome. I'm Eric Fettman, Analytics Trainer and Coach at Enor. Here's a little bit of our company history. I'll go through these slides pretty quickly. Here are our locations. We're based in the United States. We have operations in MENA as well, in Dubai and in Saudi and in the region and in Europe as well. We focus on web analytics, primarily integration with other data sets, also qualitative analytics, social analytics, testing, everything in the realm of optimization and understanding your data, making data-driven decisions. Here are some of our clients. Here are some of our MENA clients specifically. Here's our book that should be coming out in May, we hope. Here are some of the tools that you can access to help you with your analytics. You can access those on the Enor website. And I will be in Riyadh next month and in Dubai in May for training, and in cities throughout the US as well throughout the year. If you have any interest in the training and would like to come out and work with me directly, this is actually a conference from San Francisco. Our training classes are actually somewhat more intimate than this, but for more information on the training, you can go to e-nor.com/training. And for the webinar today, if you have questions, please go ahead and enter questions in the question box in the GoToWebinar panel. I probably will not be able to take questions during the webinar itself, but we will have a few minutes for Q&A. And at that point, also, I will open the microphone to anyone who has a question, so you could feel free to raise your hand as well if you don't want to type in a whole paragraph into the question box. For more information about partnering with Enor or any questions about support, you could contact my partner in the region, Abdullah Al-Kilani, abdullah@enor.com. And for any other general information, please feel free to reach out to us at any time at info@enor.com, or for questions about training, specifically the training programs, training at your location, training at e-nor.com. Okay. Google Analytics Power Webinar 6. Cross-domain tracking, cross-device tracking. Sorry for that bad paragraph break. Cross-domain tracking, cross-device tracking, and CRM integration with Google Analytics. 3 big topics, all related to, let me just open up the questions just for a second, make sure. Okay, just wanted to make sure audio is going through good. Okay, 3 big topics in Google Analytics, all somewhat related, all related to integration. A big challenge in analytics in general is integrating our data sets, and the evolution of analytics more and more is towards an integrated view of the world, not just what's going on your website, not just what's going on in your app, but what other data can you tie your Google Analytics data into. So we're going to look at that, particularly for the 3rd topic, CRM integration. But let's go ahead and get into our first topic. Oops, sorry about that. Cross-domain tracking. Surprising fact number 1. The same UA number will track from any domain. So what does that mean, that the same UA number will track from any domain? Well, if we go into Google Analytics and we have set up a property for, let's say, site.com, www.site.com, and you get the tracking code, and you see the tracking ID, that tracking ID will actually work on any website that you drop it onto. So that's a little bit surprising. You could take this tracking ID, you could take this tracking code either natively or through Google Tag Manager or through whatever your tag management system is. And this tracking ID will populate into Google Analytics from whatever site it's on. It does not have to be site.com. So that's a little surprising when you first learn about it. I know it surprised me. But another thing that is surprising is that this is not enough for cross-domain tracking. So if you have to track more than one domain as part of an integrated user experience, just taking this basic tracking code, either natively or through Google Tag Manager, is not enough. We are going to have to make some changes in order to track across domains directly. So just to illustrate that a little bit, so we've gone over our surprising facts. Let's go ahead and look at the concept of session maintenance. This is really critical for cross-domain tracking. Now, we note here that we have three websites that we're dealing with. We have site.com, we have productsite.com, and we have blogsite.com. Now, these are part of three integrated user experiences. If you were responsible for tracking these sites separately, all you would need to do would be to create separate property IDs for each of them. Instead of -1, -1, -1, you could have -1, -2, -3. Just track them separately. But if you are responsible for tracking them as part of an integrated user experience, that is when cross-domain tracking comes into play. So when we think about cross-domain tracking, we're thinking about an integrated user experience, and we're also thinking about session maintenance. This is a really critical concept in cross-domain tracking. We need to maintain the session when we're going from one domain to another. What does that mean? So here on the top of this, let's really consider this graphic. We took a little time to put this together to try to encapsulate really the key concepts in cross-domain tracking. So if we have an original source or medium, let's say that you have traffic that's coming in from Google AdWords, and you've spent however much money you've spent on that. If you're in Europe, you spent 20 euros on a click-through from Google AdWords. When that person comes into site.com and then they go over to productsite.com and they convert, you want to make sure that you are reporting that the conversion came not from site.com, but from the original source and medium. So that's maintaining the original source and medium is really, really critical, a really critical concept in cross-domain tracking. And in order to do that, and in order to maintain the session so that when you go from site.com to productsite.com, you are going to need to make some changes to your tracking code. Again, we really want to emphasize this concept of maintaining the session, whether it's in Google, if it's in the Google Analytics tag in Google Tag Manager, you can use the same container or a different container. Allow linker equals true, and auto link domains. So let's just go ahead and go into Google Tag Manager. And if we're in the container for site.com, go ahead and click into site.com. One thing that we may actually want to do is to change the container name. If we are going to be using the same Google Tag Manager container, or if you are going to be using another tag management system, you may want to change the name of the container to site8.com and cross-domain. By the way, on previous sessions, we've gone through basic Google Tag Manager setup. So if you need any kind of background on Google Tag Manager, you can access the recordings from the previous sessions on the eNOR website, and we will also be sending out additional follow-up information for this webinar as well. We've changed our container name to site.com and cross-domain to clarify that we have this container on multiple domains. Now, if we go back into the container, and we have our main Google Analytics page view tracker, go to Google Analytics, get our tracking ID. So this is all still basic setup. We haven't gotten into the cross-domain part yet. So we get our property ID from Google Analytics. We go back into Google Tag Manager, configure tag tracking ID. Now we could go ahead and paste that in. We know from previous sessions that that's actually not best practice, so we can go ahead and quickly create a variable for our tracking ID that we'll be able to use again. So we'll create the variable called Google Analytics Tracking ID. Now, at this point, we have a basic Google Analytics page view tracker, and we could fire this on all pages and it will record data, but we have not done what we need to maintain the session, to make sure that when we get a conversion on productsite.com, that it's attributed to the actual traffic source. So again, the changes that we're making now in Tag Manager will be to maintain the session so that if you have a newsletter click-through, if you have an AdWords click-through, if you have a double-click click-through, if you have an organic click-through, that is maintained as the source of the conversion on productsite.com or the activity on blogsite.com, and that site.com is not itself a referrer. So these are the steps that we need to take to maintain the session. Under more settings, we're going to go to fields to set, and this is all a little bit arbitrary. There's no real intuitive, there's nothing really especially intuitive about this. You just have to know how to do it, which is one of the reasons that you are attending the webinar today. And of course, there is the equivalent way to do this in the native tracking code, but we are demonstrating in Google Tag Manager. In the resources that we send out, we will demonstrate how to do this in native code as well, but for our discussion today, we are using Google Tag Manager because that is best practice implementation. So field name, allow linker, true. That's one thing that we have to do. Again, it seems a little bit arbitrary. This is why you're attending the webinar, so you know how to take these steps. Under cross-domain tracking, auto-link domains, you're going to put all of the domains that you are going to cross-domain track between. So site.com, productsite.com, blogsite.com. Go ahead and continue, and we could fire this tag on all pages, and we'd go ahead and create the tag and publish the container, the same steps that we would take. And of course, you would need to make sure that your container code, of course, is deployed to all of the domains. You could potentially use different containers on the different websites, but if the websites are integrated enough to use cross-domain tracking, you probably just want a single container on all the domains as well. If you don't have a single container, then you'll have to recreate the tag in each container and publish the containers separately to each site. But normally, for a cross-domain scenario, you would want one container across the multiple websites. So those are the only steps that we would need to take within Google Tag Manager to make sure that cross-domain tracking is working. Again, the only two differences are under More Settings, fields to set allow linker true. That's one difference. And under cross-domain tracking, we're going to add the websites that we want to track between. Now within Google Tag Manager, within Google Analytics, there is another step that we are going to have to take. And that is going to be under referral exclusion list. So again, we're in our property settings. So under referral exclusion list, we have the main site that is there by default. You would add the other sites. And that is the one step that you would need to take within Google Analytics. And that really is all that is required for cross-domain tracking within Google Tag Manager. Again, you could do this within the native tracking code as well, and in the resource that we send out, there will be the equivalent of the steps that we've taken in Google Tag Manager. But within Tag Manager, these are the only three steps that we have to take. We have to make these changes to the Google Analytics tag, and within Google Analytics in the admin section for our property, and just to reorient ourselves again. So we're in property for www.site.com, the original property that we created, and under referral exclusion list, we've added the additional domains. So what have we done at this point? We have achieved our session maintenance. So when a visitor comes from any traffic source and they go from site.com to productsite.com, we are maintaining the original traffic source, and also we are not starting a new session, because by default, if you traverse domains, once you go from one domain to another, you have a new cookie that's created, and the cookie has a new value for that individual, and a new session begins. So by changing the tracker and by adding the three sites to the referral exclusion list, we're maintaining the session, we're not starting a new session, and we're maintaining the original traffic source and medium, which really is the whole point of cross-domain tracking. Okay, so we looked at allow linker true, cross domains, looked at the referral exclusion list. As a related consideration, tracking across subdomains, the first question that you want to ask yourself about tracking across subdomains is, do they constitute the same experience or a different user experience? So if you have www and news or test or any other subdomain, if you want to track those separately, just create a separate Google Analytics property. If you want to track them to the same domain, if you have www and news.com and you want to track them to the same domain, you can use the same tracking code, but the one change that you have to make in Google Tag Manager, so if we're tracking across subdomains, not full domains, but if we're tracking just across subdomains, the one change that we have to make in our tag is we need to set cookie domain to auto, or you could set it to you could just set it to the root domain of the sites that you are tracking across. So that is what you would need to do for subdomain tracking in Google Tag Manager. That's just a consideration. But again, when you are tracking across subdomains, if you have www and news, and you're tracking those as separate properties, if you're tracking those as separate end user experiences, just create two separate properties in Google Analytics. Go ahead and create a new property for news.mysite.com. But if news and www are being tracked as the same domain in Google Tag Manager, the only change that you need to make is to make sure that the cookie domain is set to either your root domain or to auto, which normally comes out to the same thing. So that's a consideration for cross subdomain tracking. Now here's another consideration for roll-up reporting, and sometimes roll-up reporting and cross-domain tracking are discussed in the same way. The difference between roll-up reporting and cross-domain tracking is roll-up reporting is done purely for a reporting experience. It has nothing to do with the end user experience. So again, if we jump back for a second to our cross-domain illustration, this represented an integrated end user experience that needed to be tracked as one thing. So therefore we needed to change the tracking code to make the alterations to the tracking code to maintain the session. If we jump ahead to roll-up reporting, in roll-up reporting, we are only integrating our Google Analytics data into one property for reporting purposes only. So here we have a company that makes fans and turbines. We have wind turbine, jet turbine, industrialfan.com, not related from an end user standpoint at all. This property will integrate all of the Google Analytics data so the CEO in one glance can look at one Google Analytics property and see everything that's going on the three websites. So roll-up reporting is purely for a reporting standpoint. It can be very useful as well, but it's not about an integrated end user experience. So that really is the distinguishing factor between roll-up reporting and cross-domain tracking. So it's not integrated for reporting only, no need to maintain the session, and the default tracking code is fine across all three of the domains. Here's something that we need to consider though for cross-domain tracking or roll-up reporting or subdomain tracking. By default in Google Analytics, the only portion of the URL that shows up in the pages report is the request URI. So what comes after the main domain. So stop and think, if you are tracking across multiple domains, or if you have roll-up reporting, or even if you have multiple subdomains that are feeding into the same Google Analytics property, how are you going to be able to tell which host name, with the host name being the fully qualified domain name, how are you going to be able to tell which host name the page view is occurring on? And also, if you have pages that are similarly named across the different domains, they're going to be smashed together within your pages report by default. Now you could apply host domain as a secondary dimension, but what we may want to do instead, so it's clear for everyone who's accessing Google Analytics, is we may want to add the host name right to the page dimension. So you see what we're doing here. Whereas before we had 150,000 page views of index.php, we see here by adding the host name that we had 83,000 on wind turbine and 66,000 on jet turbine, and they're no longer appearing together as a single metric. Now, how are we going to do this? Well, we could do this with a Google Analytics filter. So this looks a little bit strange when you first see it, but again, we will have this in the reference material that we'll send out following the webinar, what we are going to do to achieve this longer, more meaningful page value is set up a filter. So you can rewrite any data that's coming into Google Analytics. We'll call this filter hostname plus request URI, the request URI just being the page value. So we're going to go to custom, going to go to advanced, so select field. So we're going to say give me the domain name, and we're going to take the whole domain name as a wildcard match, and you're going to say give me the request URI, which is just the page value, and we're going to output those two fields back out to the request URI. So again, don't worry too much about this. It looks a little bit strange when you're first looking at it, but this is how we could, in a very straightforward way, take the host name and add it to the request URI. So we're taking host name plus request URI, we're outputting it back to the request URI, meaning the page value, and we are going to end up with a pages report that looks like something on the right. So that's just a kind of an important consideration when you're setting up cross-domain tracking or cross-subdomain tracking or roll-up reporting. We're going to go ahead and move on now to our other topic. If you have questions about cross-domain tracking, subdomain tracking, please make sure to enter them. Cross-device tracking. This is a separate topic, not related directly to cross-domain tracking. In this case, we're talking about tracking an individual person across different devices. Now, how are we going to do that? Well, there's not any magic to it. Sometimes you hear about cross-device tracking and we think that there's a way to magically track people across different devices. There's really no magic. What you're doing is you're taking a user ID from your back end. So when someone logs in, it has to be an authenticated session. That is how Google Analytics ties data in, data that's captured on different devices, and attributes it to the same person. There has to be authentication involved, meaning that the person has to log in, and you are responsible for passing an extra piece of information into Google Analytics in the form of a user ID from the back end. So that is how it's achieved. Let's go ahead and take a look at some of the reports that we get specifically for cross-device tracking, and then we will go ahead and look at implementation for cross-device tracking. One report that we get is the device overlap report. So this is showing us the amount of overlap among users between devices. So we could get a quick idea of the amount of overlap between desktop and tablet, desktop and mobile, and so forth. Now the device paths report, this is where it starts to get a little more granular and a little more interesting as well. In the device paths report, and this is another report that when you're looking at it first, it's a little bit hard to interpret. But let's look at row 4. Now, in row 4, we're saying that for 178 users, their sessions, not just necessarily, this is not a single instance of a visit on a tablet plus one single instance of a visit on a desktop, because you see that there were 949 sessions total. So with this report, what row 4 is representing here is there in 178 instances, the user started once or twice or 3 times on a tablet or more, and then at a certain point transitioned over to desktop once or twice or 3 or however many times. So that is how we can interpret row 4. If we go down to row 9, how are we interpreting row 9? Well, row 9 was desktop, mobile desktop, which means that the user had one or more sessions on desktop, and then one or more sessions on mobile, and then one or more sessions on desktop as well. Again, logged in sessions. These were sessions in which the user logged in at least once. They're kind of tricks if someone logs in just one time, but the login had to occur at least one time on each device type. So we see the number of users that followed that pattern in the first row. We can also see, if we go over to the fourth column, we can see the revenue that was generated through that series of interactions on different devices. So we can start to get a picture of what types of user journeys are generating revenue. And also, if we continue on that theme and we look at the acquisition device report, this is showing, if we look at, let's say, row 2, we could see that there were 763 users who originated on tablet. They had 1,910 sessions completely. And the revenue that occurred on the originating device was, in this case, it's dollars, $574,000, and revenue on other devices was $158,000. Now, if we go up to desktop, interestingly, we could see that $3,600,000 originated on the desktop, but for $1 million, there was actually switch over from desktop to other devices. So you could begin to get an idea of the pattern. We see that for mobile, there was $111,000 generated on the mobile device and 44,000 switch over to another device category. So we can start to use these reports to see what the paths are to revenue. There's a very strong e-commerce slant to the acquisition device reports and to the cross-device reports in general. But this could start to give us an idea of, well, where should I be advertising? Where should I be targeting my AdWords? What devices should I be targeting my AdWords for? So this really gives valuable insight as to what people are really doing. Now, how would we implement the cross-device tracking? We've looked at the reporting, but we haven't talked about implementation. It's not too difficult. It's very straightforward within Google Analytics. First thing that we're going to have to do is under tracking info, and this is a little bit unintuitive, but we are going to have to create a dedicated view based on user ID. And whenever you see user ID in Google Analytics, think cross-device. Whenever you see user ID, think cross-device tracking. They're always used in the same context. User ID is specifically about cross-device tracking. So we're going to go ahead and click into user ID. I agree to the user ID policy, which is basically saying don't store any personally identifiable data as the user ID. So no email address, no government ID, no name, nothing like that can be used as user ID. It has to be anonymous. Next step, session unification. Yes, we want to keep this on. This will pull in data after the user logs in on the session. So next step, we're actually creating a view here. This is the only instance in Google Analytics where you create a view not under the create a view menu. So we're actually creating a view from the property level. So we'll go ahead and click create a view. Let's call this view user ID enabled, and we'll say cross domain, just to emphasize. And we go ahead and create the view. And once you've created this view, these three reports become accessible within the view. So we create the view. Obviously, it's not populated yet, but if we go into the reporting session and we go under admin, we have a new cross-device report with device overlap, device paths, acquisition device, which we have demonstrated in the previous slides. Now, this is the easy part. We've just done the easy part of cross device tracking. The part that's a little bit harder, that will probably involve your developers to a small extent, will be to actually populate the user ID into Google Analytics. Again, there is no magic in cross-device tracking. We are tying in the sessions by providing a common back-end user ID to Google Analytics. So how are we going to do that? Well, typically you don't see the user ID anywhere in the interface. So typically what you would do is, if your user ID is already somewhere in the code of the page, it already exists in JavaScript in some format, you could pull it in as a variable in Google Tag Manager or whatever tag management system you're using. If the user ID does not exist on the page as well, what you would do normally is you would work with your developers to add an additional little piece of code to the page, and you're going to populate the data layer. You're going to populate the Google Tag Manager data layer with the user ID variable. So you're going to say our user ID is whatever the value is for this individual when they log in. So to work with the developer, you push this user ID value to the data layer, and how do we populate this user ID into Google Analytics? Well, once it's in the data layer, if we go back to Google Tag Manager or whatever your tag management system is, what we would do is we are going to, let's go ahead and delete this and start from fresh. For all of your Google Analytics tags, so for your page view tags, and we talked about event tracking, I think, in the first webinar that we had, what you would do is each time that you're sending a hit, each time that you're sending a page view or an event to Google Analytics, you're going to send that user ID with it. So we're going to go ahead and click Add Field. User ID is a built-in field name. Now the value is going to be pulled in by a variable. So we're going to go ahead and create a new variable. Again, if this variable already exists on the page as, let's say, a JavaScript variable, go ahead and pull it in. You don't have to write to the data layer if the value already exists anywhere on the page. If it happens to exist somewhere on the user interface, that's not usual to have an account number on an interface, but if you do, you can pull it in as a DOM element and just pull it in as your H2 tag or an element from the page. But in most cases, you are going to have to write the user ID to the data layer, and we're going to then pull it in as a data layer variable into Google Tag Manager. So let's call this data layer user ID. We go ahead and click into data layer variable. Now the data layer variable name is just going to be the value that we've used in pushing the variable to the data layer. So in this case, it's just user ID. So we could go ahead and read that out of the data layer by just specifying user ID as the data layer variable name. Create variable, and that's it. So you see that the hardest part of this scenario in most cases, is going to be getting this user ID out of your backend when the user authenticates and writing it to the page. So that's something that you probably need to work with your developers on. Again, if this user ID is already present on the page, you could use another Google Tag Manager variable to read it in, but in most cases, you'd work with your developers right to the data layer, and then you'd read it in from the data layer with a variable in Google Tag Manager. And then in Google Tag Manager, every time that you're sending a page view, every time you're sending an event, you are pushing the user ID with it as well, and that is what allows Google Analytics to recognize, okay, Joseph logged in on his laptop and then he logged in on his tablet, and this is how we're recognizing him as the same person, because in both cases his ID was recorded as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 ABCDE. So that is really the essence of cross-device tracking. If you do have an authenticated end user experience, meaning if people do log into your website, by all means implement cross-device tracking. It's a really important additional insight that you can get that you will not get by default in Google Analytics. So we're going to move on to CRM integration for right now. And CRM integration is somewhat related to cross-device tracking in that it involves using a unique key to identify different users in different data sets. So for cross-device tracking, we were talking about using a unique user key to identify users on different devices. For CRM integration, we're going to be talking about using a user key to identify users in different data sets completely, Google Analytics versus CRM or any kind of back-end system that you're using. Okay. Why do we need CRM integration? Let's consider this example. So let's say that you are running a campaign. So this is a fictitious campaign for a microchip company. And this microchip company needs to generate leads. So it's a high-end lead for an important purchase, probably millions of dollars, a significant advertising budget. Now, if you were to run, let's say, 4 campaigns. So here we have 4 campaigns top to bottom. We have a campaign that's running on LinkedIn. We have a campaign that's running on Google AdWords. We have a campaign that's running on Facebook. And we have a campaign that's running on Twitter. So here we have we're driving people to this chip choices page. It's a microchip company, and we are spending a lot of money driving folks to this chip choices page to get them just to submit an inquiry, because there's going to be a long sales process after the submission is made. So we've driven traffic to the page and we see the number of goal completions. So if we see chip report all the way on the right, chip report goal to completions, we see that there were 11 goal completions, for example, for LinkedIn. For Facebook, there were 6. So it says, okay, so that's pretty good. If we look at our conversion rate, that's a 20% conversion rate ranging to a 6% conversion rate. That's pretty good as a conversion rate, but what is the issue here? What visibility do we not get in Google Analytics? The visibility that we don't get in Google Analytics is the quality of the lead. Was it a qualified lead, or was it not a qualified lead? So what we want to look at is, okay, so the cost, we're looking at the cost per lead, and on top, what we have demonstrated on top is we've looked at the multi-channel funnel report, and we've seen that there were some leads that were actually split between 2 different sources. So we've given the different sources partial credit, which as we've talked about in a previous session, whenever you're doing analysis of your conversions, you should always look at the multi-channel funnel reports to see if there were multiple sources that were leading to conversions in a later session. So we've adjusted for the multi-channel funnel reports, and what we've ended up with on bottom is we've split some of the leads and we've calculated a cost per lead. But this is still not taking into account whether the leads were qualified or not. So we're looking at the cost per lead, but we're looking at the cost for all leads, good leads and garbage leads as well. So it's not really a true cost per good lead. How can Google Analytics know if the lead was good or not? Google Analytics can't know if the lead was good or not. That's not its job. Now, if we look at the back-end system, so you have your sales folks who are going in on the back end, contacting the leads, following up with them, and we see that ultimately there were only two leads that were actually qualified. We know that the quality of leads that comes in generally is not, they're more unqualified than qualified leads that come in ultimately. Certainly more that come in that don't close than that do close. But we see in this case, Heather Quinn and Bruce Kozar were qualified leads. They were the salespeople contacted them, and these were the only two people among these leads who were actually qualified. So what we want to do, what we want to get to, is we want to be able to link the qualification. So we have the qualification column. We want to be able to link that back to the fourth column, which is the campaign column. So we want to see what the different traffic sources were for the qualified leads. What do we need to do to achieve that? That is not going to be anything that Google Analytics is going to provide out of the box. Google Analytics cannot report on lead qualification status on your back-end system. But this is the type of integration that we want to get to. We want to be able to see qualification in the second column matched with the campaign that drove the conversion in the first column. So what we want to get to is an actual cost per qualified lead. And the only way that we can do that is by integrating our data sources. So how are we going to do that? Well, again, it's not magic when we are integrating our data sources. When we're talking about integrating data, as we know, even if we've done the most basic SQL with normalization of tables, it's all about keys. It's all about a way to join one table, one data set to another data set. So this, you might be thinking a little bit along the lines of user ID, the way we track the user ID for our cross-device tracking. Well, we're going to use a similar technique for capturing a CRM key into Google Analytics for sessions. And just going to look at an illustration that we have here. And this is a little bit busy, but the one thing that we want to look at here, one thing that we really want to keep in mind is that as long as there is a unique key between your CRM system, so if you look at the top right, as long as you end up with a unique key between your CRM system and Google Analytics at the bottom as a custom dimension, as long as there is a unique key on the back end and in Google Analytics as a custom dimension, at that point we have the information that we need to tie in your authenticated Google Analytics sessions, meaning that the user is authenticated on your website or in your app, and we're going to be able to tie that into the back-end data. Now, how are we going to achieve this? It's going to be somewhat similar to user ID, but what we would do in Tag Manager and in Google Analytics is the first step in Google Analytics is going to be to create a custom dimension. And we talked a lot about custom dimensions in our last session. Again, that recording is available on the website on our Google Analytics Power Webinar pages. So for more about event tracking and custom dimensions in Google Tag Manager, feel free to review the recording from the last session. But since we know about custom dimensions from that session, how are we going to set up a custom dimension? In our property settings, we go to custom definitions, custom dimensions, new custom dimension. And let's go ahead and we're going to call this visitor ID just to distinguish it from the user ID dimension that's already defined by default. For the scope of our custom dimension, we'll go ahead and change that to session. We could actually go ahead and change it to user as well. Let's go ahead and change it to users, because that way, even if someone doesn't log in on a following session and the cookie is available, the data will still be tied together. So we'd go ahead and create that custom dimension. In the last session, we looked at taking the index. So this is the first custom dimension that we've created in the property. And it probably won't be surprising to know that we're going to use this in Google Tag Manager to pull in our visitor ID key. So what we would do, again, we're just making changes to the basic Google Analytics tracker. Wouldn't need the cross-domain tracking necessarily. So under custom dimensions, add custom dimension. Our index is 1, so we're back in Tag Manager. Now we're populating the custom dimension. Now what dimension value could we use? Well, we could take that same user ID that we've used for cross-domain tracking, and we could go ahead and use it for our CRM integration as well. So we could take the user ID, it's that same key. In one case, for cross-device tracking, we populated that as user ID, and we're also taking the same dimension value and we're populating it into the custom dimension for our visitor key. So we're able to tie in to the backend. So this one variable is serving two purposes. Now, you can use the same ID for cross-device and store it as a custom dimension as well. Make sure that you integrate your data sets outside of Google Analytics. It's most of the time when we're talking about integrated data, when we're talking about getting to this type of integrated data, in most cases we are talking about doing it outside of Google Analytics. Why couldn't we do this type of integration within Google Analytics? Because we have people's names, and PII, personally identifiable information, never, ever allowed in Google Analytics. That's evolving a little bit. We'll see how that changes with user ID, with more user level analysis, but at this point you definitely cannot pull names into Google Analytics, even through data import. That's definitely against the terms of service, but you can export out of Google Analytics. So you could do this type of integration either in your CRM system or in a spreadsheet or in any kind of SQL-based system or in BigQuery or in any data visualization package. You can do this level of integration outside of Google Analytics, but not within Google Analytics, because you cannot have PII within Google Analytics directly, but it's fine to export from Google Analytics and then integrate with PII. Okay, so that's actually just to go back for a second with CRM integration. Definitely a best practice is when users authenticate, at the same time that you're setting up cross-device tracking, set up the CRM integration as well, because it's largely the same process, and usually the biggest part of the hurdle for both CRM integration and for user and for cross-device tracking. In both cases, the biggest step, if we just back up, is usually getting the user ID out of the back end. Once you have that on your page, you see how, especially with Google Tag Manager or with another tag management system, how easy it is to pull that data into Google Analytics as the user ID for cross-device tracking or as the visitor ID extra dimension for the integration between the CRM and Google Analytics. So this is the hardest part. Once you have the user ID in your data layer, make sure to set up cross-device tracking and make sure to add this user ID as a custom dimension to Google Analytics, because that is what is going to allow you to integrate your CRM data with your Google Analytics data. And do it now, because even if you don't know what type of analysis you're going to do going forward, in a year from now, if you retroactively want to see all of the traffic sources that originally led to a transaction, and let's say you wanted to see lifetime value. Well, if someone transacted today from a $50 AdWords click-through or let's say a 200 dirham AdWords click-through, and then they purchased 2 more times by calling in, you're not going to be able to see the original source unless you have tied that into Google Analytics with the user ID. So make sure that you do the integration, the CRM integration, and the cross-device tracking at the same time. And it's a big win. And even if you don't know what level of analysis you're going to do right now, you want to make sure to have that key in there, because without the key, you cannot do any kind of retroactive analysis for lead qualification or for lifetime value or for any of the other reasons that you would want to tie your CRM integration in to Google Analytics. So with that, actions and exercises, we kind of took in a lot today, and we have a few minutes for Q&A. But the primary actions today are assess your need for cross-domain or subdomain tracking or roll-up reporting. If you have a need for them, we have a guide that you can follow. Make sure that you get that set up. If you don't have a specific need for cross-domain or subdomain or roll-up reporting, don't worry about it. Not everyone has a need for that. Even if you are reporting on multiple properties, if there is not anyone who needs all of that data integrated into a single property, just go ahead and track the property separately. Cross-domain tracking, roll-up reporting, they are there when you need them, but they're certainly not obligatory in all cases. For cross-device tracking and CRM integration, I would say that if you do have an authenticated end user experience, meaning if people do log into your website or to your app, go ahead and take the steps that you need to implement cross-device tracking and CRM integration. You don't have to do it today or tomorrow, but make sure that you go ahead and implement these 2 customizations. Again, the hardest part is getting the user ID out of the back end, and you really are immediately in cross-device tracking going to have access to some very interesting reports, especially if you have e-commerce, because there is an e-commerce orientation to the cross-device tracking reports, but even without e-commerce, it's useful. And for CRM integration, even if you don't know how you're going to integrate right now, you need to have that common key between Google Analytics and, again, just think that you need to have a common key between your CRM and Google Analytics. Even if 2 years from now you want to do some kind of retroactive analysis, if you decide 2 years from now you want to see lifetime value based on original Google Analytics source and you haven't been tracking this visitor ID, guess what? You're out of luck, because there's no magic about this. It's about having a common key within the different data sets. So the sooner you start capturing that common key, the better position you're going to be able to do that type of back retroactive analysis whenever you need to do that. So those are the actions for today. So thank you for attending. We are at time, but if anyone wants to hang out, I'm happy to stay on. Let me see if there are any questions. Recording will be sent out, by the way, as I mentioned, along with links to some additional sources. Let's see. We have Okay, looks like we have a couple of questions here, and let me also okay, we have a question from okay, I started on a site and I want to track incoming campaigns from a producer's site. Their list varies, so putting their individual name results in a long list. Is my code okay? That looks okay. I will follow up with that individual question. I think the code looks okay on that, looking at the native code, but I will follow up individually on that question and make sure that I have understood it correctly. Yes, the webinar will be recorded and will be available. Other options besides user login to track across device, the login really does have to occur on the device in order for Google Analytics to be able to recognize the user from one device for another. As I mentioned, there really isn't any magic at this point about it. At some point, there may be some type of tie-in to Google accounts on different devices. If someone has logged into, let's say, their Gmail on different devices, there may be a tie-in at some point. But at this point, the only way to track across devices is through some kind of authentication. So it can be exciting when you first hear, and it is kind of exciting when you first hear about cross-device tracking, but it sounds a little magical at first. There really, as I mentioned, there isn't any magic to it. You're taking a value from the back end and you are pushing it into Google Analytics as an additional little piece of data. Will that change at some point? I've heard the question before, and it's an interesting question. There may be a change in that at some point. Just overall, Google Analytics is definitely evolving towards more of a user-centric model and not a session-centric model. Even some of the reports are changing to have user-based metrics versus session-based metrics. So I think in the next probably year, maybe, don't quote me on this because I certainly don't know for sure, but in the next year or two, we may see other options besides actual direct authentication. So it's a great question, and you're probably ahead of the game cognitively relative to what everyone else is doing now for cross-device tracking. Not cognitively, but you know what I mean with that. But at this point, you do need to log in order to achieve cross-device tracking. But even with that limitation, definitely go ahead and do it. It's definitely useful. And make sure to store that user ID as a custom dimension as well in Google Analytics, because the user ID that you use for cross-device tracking is never, I shouldn't say never, it's visible in BigQuery, but that's the only place it's visible. It's not visible within the Google Analytics reporting interface, and it's not even visible within the Google Analytics API. So you do need, for the CRM integration, take that same user ID and store it in a custom dimension. Okay, let me see if there are any hands that are raised. I'm not seeing any, so I'm going to go ahead and conclude the webinar at this point. Again, thank you everyone for logging in and for staying on a few minutes late. We have concluded this webinar series, but we should have some more coming up. And for sure, please, if you haven't signed up for our mailing list, if you go to our blog, e-nor.com/blog or /training, and you see the obnoxious pop-up that comes up. The pop-up's a little obnoxious, but we promise to provide good, valuable content. We're producing a lot more content. We're keeping everyone updated as features change and as features appear within Google Analytics, so please do sign up for our mailing list. And thank you again for signing on, and thanks for participating in this webinar series, and be on the lookout, please, for additional resources from us. Thank you, everyone.